we need to let go of the growth pursuit. But people hear is I'm anti-growth. And I'm not against growth. I just think if it contributes to well-being, let's do it. If it doesn't, why bother?
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest who will introduce herself. Gaya, please go ahead.
Hello, happy to be here.
Yeah, great.
So my name is Gaya Herrington. I was born in the Netherlands, but I've been living in the US for the past 9 years. And I am currently working at Schneider Electric in their Research Sustainability Institute. So I'm a sustainability researcher with a focus on how to change the economic system in a way that it produces things that are just really beneficial socially and environmentally speaking. And how I got there was really I studied econometrics in the Netherlands at Free University of Amsterdam. And then as it typically went in those days, then you just get plucked up by the financial sector. So that's where I ended up just before the financial crisis hit. And then I actually left just before because I didn't really understand what we were doing. I was looking at these things and I was like, these valuations seem so divorced from the actual risks that are out there. And then as it turns out later, I was sort of right.
Mm-hmm.
So I eventually ended up at the Dutch Central Bank regulating. And once I started doing that, I started to analyze how risks actually interact with one another. Because what regulators typically do is they have one specific risk that they regulate, and then every colleague has a different one that they focus on. But what you saw in the crisis is that they actually really interact a lot. And then I'm talking about very technical risks like market risk, liquidity risk, credit risk. But then I realized, wait, it's not just these financial risks that are interrelated. Environmental risk, behavioral, political, social, this is all interrelated as well. And we're not really treating it as if that's the case. So that's when I went back to study sustainability at Harvard. And in the meantime, I had started working at KPMG in the US. They asked me to do this kind of analysis work for them over there. So that was very interesting. And then my thesis at Harvard, I did on the first system dynamics model of the world, which was created by MIT scientists in the 70s. And that was really the first model that did precisely, as I just mentioned, that. So it modeled the interactions between pollution, population, industrial output, the natural resources we have, and all of those things, human services, education, and health. And all of those things, and then how those interact, and then how those develop over time throughout the 21st century, because this was still done in the 20th century. And then what they found, based on that, and to their own surprise at the time, was, well, this pursuit of growth that we have in our society, right? We measure our success by how much our income is growing, how much profit is growing, how much GDP is growing every quarter. As if we keep doing that, we will, the humanity will experience a collapse, meaning a steep decline from a previous peak somewhere in the 21st century. And actually, they put the peak of that collapse around today, present time. Mm-hmm. And so just a few years ago, I was like, well, given that prospect, let's see how much empirical data, because we have empirical data now, a few decades worth, let's see how that matches up. And then what I found was that it's actually, we're still following that business as usual scenario. It was not the only scenario. They created other scenarios with the model, but the one based on historical averages only, the business as usual, that one showed a collapse. That doesn't mean the end of human civilization. It doesn't mean the end of all humans, but it does mean kind of the end of society as we know it, because it's a steep decline from previous peaks. That it was also in population, in industrial output, in food production, and welfare levels. So I published that research in a paper, a peer-reviewed article, Yale's Journal of Industrial Ecology, and that went a little bit viral at the time.
You're really being modest here. But yeah.
Well, but it's funny because editors just love the word collapse, right? So it's basically it was interpreted as a prediction of doom, but it's not a prediction at all. It's a warning, right? So we can't go on like this. But it was also in there, it was like, hey, there's this other scenario that we're not closely aligned with. So we're not on that trajectory, but we're still close enough to it that if we deliberately change our behavior, we could still align ourselves with that. That's also what I said in my research. That made it into the headlines much less. But that's really what has led me to my research today, because in that scenario, the stabilized world scenario in that research, humanity deliberately lets go of the growth pursuit and adopts a new goal, which is not something that humans typically do. Humans are very married psychologically to their prevalent narrative, to the system as they know it, but it is certainly possible. We've done that in history before. And it is completely feasible to change the goal. So instead of growth, however that is measured, GDP is arguably a very bad measure, but any measure really, growth on a finite planet is always bad. It's always unsustainable. So instead, what you want to be aiming for is meeting human needs within ecological boundaries. That's a much better goal. And that is totally possible. We've had those goals implicitly in a lot of societies throughout history. We still see that today with some indigenous populations, for example, and there are still fragments of it also in certain countries. So there's let's say Costa Rica, who's very much has rights of nature in their entire governance system. We have Bhutan, who measures with a gross national happiness index instead of GDP. So it's all it's possible. It's in us. It's not what we currently are doing. And so this new economic system is, I would call, well-being economics, and that's what my current research is focused on.
And I'm really fascinated by that, and my listeners also know that I've talked in past episode with Kees Klomp, who's also from the Netherlands, actually, who wrote about this. I had a talk with Jos Spodek, you as well. He really changed his life. I really would like to go there to system changes, because I'm really interested in that as well. But before we go there, I have a lot of, let's say, younger listeners who always ask me questions about, how do you get from where you are now? How do I make a career, or how do I find work that is really an extension of what I'm about? So I would like to ask you to go a few steps back, and one is, because you were saying we can still change. So my question to you is, can you change? Are you changing? And then link that back to where you grew up, and how was your upbringing? What was that about? And take us through that a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good, it's a good question, because I personally think that the systems change that we need is at the same time very personal. So it's almost a little bit counterintuitive at first, because you are part of this big system, but this means that you are influenced sometimes by parts in the system that you have no control over, which is quite a mindset shift to where we also have this, I think, a narrative in society that is still quite prevalent. You make your own destiny. You force your own luck, and if you work hard, it will always pay off. I do think that you should work hard and have good values and be kind, etc. But the truth is that sometimes the outcomes are influenced by a system that you have just by yourself very little control over.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be quite overwhelming to look at that, realize that, and then go, how do I even start making a change here? And I would say that it really starts on a very deeply personal level, and it can't end there. That's what I always say. You can't save the world by just recycling, but that is where it starts. What really has value to me, and indeed look back at your own life and see how that has shaped your perspective, and realize, well, other people have very different perspectives, and then from those values that you've identified, see where you can find your best part in the system. I will say that you don't have to have a lot of power or control in the system, so you don't have to be a CEO to make that change. I think everybody can do change. That's the good thing about working in a system. Everything you do matters. But yeah, it starts with that personal thing. So for me, my name Gaya I was named after the goddess of the earth. So that's because my parents were hippies. So in that sense, I think I already got that rudimentary, the appreciation of nature was already, I think, quite in me from a quite young age. I think at the same time, I also grew up in the Netherlands, which is these days, I live in the US, so some people think that's some kind of socialist country. But the truth is that, that's where capitalism was first conceived, that the Dutch made that up. And the US at some point took it and really went with it, but it originated from the Netherlands. So that's very interesting. I think that I too had at some point this idea of where this illusion of control and stability. And that, I guess that's just the time I grew up in, right? The Fukuyama end of history kind of idea that we've kind of figured it out. And we're still gonna have events, but this is it. And that's I've come to realize that this is not the case, that I actually think it's almost the opposite. I think we live in an incredibly important time in history, and what we do now for the next 5 to maximum 10 years will determine welfare levels for the rest of this century. Because as I said, we have time to change still, but that window of opportunity is closing fast. And it's not just me and my research who say that, right? We know this, the climate scientists, but also other scientists that monitor biodiversity levels say we're going to have biodiversity mass die-off tipping points within the next 5 to 10 years if we don't drastically, basically stop killing every other thing that we can't directly eat. We have plenty of pigs in the world, but the rest of the species are not doing so great. And that's just the environmental ones. A few of the environmental ones, same with water scarcity, desertification. But of course, there's also the social tipping points, like income and wealth inequality is clearly, I think, at a breaking point. I don't know how that's going to unfold, but I do know it's not going to stay like this. We see some increased geopolitical turmoil. I think all those things are so what my research said, and I think is confirmed by what we could all observe around us, is limits to growth basically will be forced upon us one way or the other. So we can choose our own limits, or they will be forced upon us through ecosystem breakdown.
Yeah, and to go back to your, you said, okay, you got the name Gaia because your parents were hippies. So how else did that influence you? because if I read your work, I see a global citizen. It's about we're all interconnected, and then we have to solve it together. But I think one of the problems is that maybe many of us are tribal, and so and that is hampering our collaboration and our really working together. So what happened in you when you went to school, and how did you grow up that you got that perspective? Did you start traveling very quickly, or
so I do think that traveling really opens up
Hmm.
your mind, doesn't it? And you just see that once you start going out of your bubble, you realize, oh, this is just one version of so many. So I do think traveling, just by the sheer uncomfortability of it, because it is quite uncomfortable, it just opens your mind. So that's certainly absolutely true. I think it was a real gradual process. I really think that because my first study was in econometrics, right? And that's one school of economics. It's called economics, but really it's just one school, the neoclassical economics. And it is quite what are called mental models. So are often unconscious, subconscious ideas of how the world works. And those ideas are, we're all selfish optimizers. And maybe a little bit in the vein of what you said about our tribal side. And we just, that's how we go through life. And so we're all optimizing, but that's fine because the market will deliver a maximum benefit for all through that selfish pursuit. That's the underlying mental model there. And then you start to travel and you see a lot of things that just don't fit into that model at all. And I think I think I probably had a rudimentary idea of that growing up with my hippie parents, but it only got really formalized during my studies at Harvard, where I started, for example, to learn about the difference between needs and wants, which I think is very interesting that this isn't taught at all. That these are very often just presented as interchangeable. But to your question, what you said about, well, how we're going to do that, because clearly we're tribal, and so that hampers our ability to cooperate and come together. The thing is, that's the whole point with well-being economics. It makes a clear distinction between human needs and wants. So what I said earlier, I also said the goal should be meeting human needs within ecological limits. Wants are not in there. Wants are not bad. You can have wants, it's fine. But they are not as important as needs. So there are clear differences between needs and wants, actually. A lot of people might already be aware, for example, of Maslow's pyramid of needs, right? And these are actually universal. So there's this notion that, well, everybody should satisfy their own wants because, we can't decide for you what you want. But the truth is, when it comes to needs, we all have the same things. We all need food, shelter, water, and sex, safety. And then come the social, those are more physiological. And then come the social needs. We want to feel respected. We want to feel that our jobs every day are not just tricks for money, but that we actually contribute to our community. Those are real needs. We mentally suffer if we don't have that. And that goes back to what you said earlier about young people, like, where can I find a job? You want a job that has an income where you can satisfy your more physiological needs. And that's very understandable. At the same time, even people will have that in say, the richer countries, right? They are more often than not, are disengaged at work because they don't feel like what they do every single day adds real societal value. And that's why I think this notion of a well-being economy actually would certainly deliver to a lot of people whose basic needs aren't even met, right? They don't have access to clean water, all those things. That's very clear how they would benefit from a well-being economy. But I think people like you and I, for example, even we would benefit because we would have our social and then our spiritual needs, and a need to serve a higher purpose. Those would actually also be met much more in a well-being economy. So yeah, if you ask me, how do we get there then? The larger picture answer is that, well, we have to meet human needs first, because it is true that we're not really Homo economicus, actually. We're more of a Homo duplex. So when our basic needs are not met, we really are quite selfish and short-term focused. And this is completely understandable. You skip lunch once and, you become completely unspeakable. At least if I skip lunch, don't talk to me. So when your needs are not met, where you're tired or hungry, or just unhealthy or feel unsafe, you're not going to worry about climate change. This is very understandable. But once those needs are met, we actually become, and that's the other part of it, we become very curious and altruistic, and just really mostly motivated by contributing to the greater good. We want connection with people. We want a sense of meaning, a sense of self-development. And that's the great thing about this well-being economics. It will deliver for everybody. You will absolutely have to do with less material. So it's not like it's a free lunch. There will be less stuff, because the other part, the ecological well-being, we are all in the richer nations above Earth's carrying capacity, our share of it. So we will have to bring down our material footprint. But that doesn't mean that we're going to live in huts. It just means that, for example, private jets, except for government officials, should probably be banned. People will not be able to have big yachts anymore. This will have almost no impact for the vast majority of the population. But also things like, obviously, we need to move away from fossil fuels. We will still have energy, but it will be generated through renewable sources. We will still have clothes, but this enormous fast fashion sector should be shrunk, because there's a lot of environmental pollution there, a lot of waste that is created. A lot of these things just fall apart after 3 wears, and the way they are created is not good for the well-being of the people who make our clothes. So those kind of things. So we have to give up some of that, but I would argue we get so much more back.
And what I like, listening to you, and what I also liked when I read the book, is that, and you said this in the beginning, is that there is still hope that we can, change the equation. Having said that, both within our own country, the Netherlands, we have a lot of polarization, and people don't seem to want to make changes. The same in the US. So I very much always look at the model of Ken Wilber, as I mentioned to you, and that says that every issue, problem that we look at, has at least 4 perspectives: I, we, it, and its. So it and its is looking at system changes, processes, but you can't do that without changing within yourself and looking at your community. Is that something similar that you getting at within your book, and then the actions that are necessary to change the system that we have developed?
Yes, I think so. I have in my book, for example, I have the systems iceberg, and the different levels you are working at. And so I do think and we already touched upon that just a little bit in the beginning, right? There's your personal. You start with your personal, and then you look in your direct community, and then you look at the bigger system. So I think all those layers need to be there. You're absolutely right. So I do think that that's something that I touch upon in my book. What I also say in my book is, at the end in my conclusion, I think I answer that question that you talk about, like, we need to change, we can, but will we, kind of thing. Because I also see a lot of polarization. I see signs that we are not willing, or we're not doing it enough. And the honest answer to the question is, I don't know. I just think that we absolutely have the technological abilities. We know the policies we need. I also think that we want to. I really do. And this is just from not just me, but just from surveys in general around the world. You see that when we ask the general population, about how they feel about their current economic system and the political system, a majority of people want deep systemic changes. They don't want just the eco-innovation and that will solve it. They realize they want the big systemic changes. We see that trust levels in the entire economic system, so capitalism are at all-time lows. People, even in the US now, the younger generation, not the general population, but the younger generation is more positive about socialism than capitalism. That doesn't mean that the future is socialist, but it does signal that there is this general idea that our current system is not working. And then what I do now is talking about an alternative, basically, that I think appeals to a lot of people. I think a lot of people like this idea of well-being, and understand these notions of basic needs, and most of us love nature, right? We love that. We are hurting when we hear about the rainforest being on fire, even though we've never been there, we probably never will visit, but we care. So this is in all of us, I think, the most of us. So I do think that we want to. Will we? That I don't. I honestly, I don't know.
And I have a question to you about because you work for Schneider Electric at the moment, right? So that is a company, in the US. So so I totally understand things that we have to change from a Western perspective. But my organization works in a lot of countries that are struggling, where there's a lot of poverty. Yeah, their voices are, we are in this situation because of you guys. So we want to have a piece of the cake as well. And I totally get that. So how do we need to go about that issue?
Yeah, excellent question. And thank you for asking it, because sometimes when I say we need to let go of the growth pursuit, what people hear is I'm anti-growth. And I'm not against growth. I just think if it contributes to well-being, let's do it. If it doesn't, why bother? And right now, what we're doing, we have this growth at all costs, even at the social and environmental costs. That's very clear. We already know that that in the richer countries, it just doesn't. Well-being levels haven't increased anymore. You hear this a lot about green growth, right? Where you hold on to the pursuit of growth, but it's going to be greener. It's going to be decoupled. I'm making air quotes now for people who are listening. And the thing is, there is no evidence that it has never worked. So there are headlines that are touting, "Ooh, these countries have reached decoupling," like in the Netherlands. But then if you look at it, it's not anywhere near like where we could pursue green growth endlessly without trashing the place. Our our Earth overshoot day, I think, is somewhere in April. Okay, we don't even make it to half the year. So yes, our GDP has increased while our carbon emissions, for example, are decreasing much less, but to the part where we have absolute decoupling, an absolute sufficient decoupling, that is nowhere in the data. And that's just carbon emissions. So there is zero decoupling on biodiversity loss, for example. You know what has decoupled? Reported happiness, life expectancy in the US for sure, health status in general. Those things have decoupled. So we can clearly, like I said, we can still improve our well-being actually, but it would be by focusing on our social and spiritual needs. And guess what? How do you get that? How do you add social connection? Well, as it turns out, a lot of solutions that lower our environmental footprint actually involve more labor, which kind of makes sense, right? You typically have maybe less capital, industrial capital. So do you compensate through that with labor, which is actually a great way to that offers hope for maintaining employment levels in a zero growth environment. Also, through that labor, typically think about, for example, the sharing economy, if it's applied accurately. That's about making connections with people in your neighborhood through the exchange of goods, right? So which addresses our need for social connection. A lot of people have no idea who their neighbors are. So all of those things are offer a lot of hope for no growth environments in the richer countries. And as you said, it's a very different story in countries where people's basic needs are not yet met. For for food, shelter, that all requires some natural capital, and that's totally fine. Those countries, they can still grow because we know that growth at lower income levels is very strongly correlated with reported happiness and health levels.
Mm-hmm.
It just starts to decouple a bit. No, actually, it starts to decouple significantly after a certain threshold, which has already been met in Western countries. But in as you say, in developing countries, they still need growth to meet their basic needs. Also, not always, but certainly many times it will. And that's precisely why the richer countries, a lot of them with a colonial past too, and in my personal opinion, a certain responsibility to help them grow. That's why they have to lower their footprint so that the developing countries can still grow.
No, thanks for that. Hey, you are an advisor to the Club of Rome. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what does that mean? What do you have to do, and what can we expect from the Club of Rome? In the near future.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Club of Rome is a group that was also established in the 70s. It's a club of thinkers from around the world. And actually that they commissioned that limits to growth study by the MIT scientists. So they in the 70s started asking questions about interconnectedness. So people with a lot of foresight, and they were like, why, despite all our progress, and these were industrialists, by the way, at the time, and I said, why, despite all of our innovation and these things that we're capable of doing, why do we still see these, what they call the continuous critical problems of humanity? Poverty, conflict, pollution, disease. Why does this keep plaguing us? And they said, presumably these things are interrelated, but how? And so that's when they asked the MIT scientists to study that. And as I mentioned, they did that study with the world model. They published that in a book called a 1972 bestseller, The Limits to Growth. And since then, and it was a bestseller, and after that it was very effectively attacked, and that's why perhaps a lot of the younger people listening to this podcast today had never heard of it. It was very effectively buried because it went too much against the notion of what progress is at the time. It's just that simple. Growth is not just growth. We have a narrative where we equate it with progress, and that's, I think, we are being told that the only way to lift people out of poverty is through growth. And that's what I always say. And like, well, we can also just do it directly, just lift them out of poverty directly. Why don't we just do that? If that is supposedly the real goal of growth, why don't we just do it directly? But of course, that's not the real reason we pursue growth. It's totally possible to meet everybody's needs without growing the pie. We just have to share the pie more equally. But that would mean that people who have large shares of the pie right now would have to give something up. And growth is indeed the only way that we can lift people out of poverty without the ultra rich giving up any of their wealth. And I think that's why it was so viciously attacked.
No, thanks for that clarification. That's really helpful. But now, some more people are looking at it again, right? So what is the Club of Rome doing now to address it?
Yeah, that's true. So and now people are like, oh, I guess that was actually quite on the ball, which is a shame because at the time we were actually still below our Earth's carrying capacity. So if we would have heeded the message of the limits to growth at the time, we could have had a relatively smooth transition towards Earth's carrying capacity without overshoot. Now we've been above Earth's carrying capacity for the last few decades. And so it's a very different story. This is a very common pattern in ecology. You go above any ecosystem's carrying capacity, you have an overshoot, that's called, and then you inevitably always have a collapse. And so that's where we are. And so now the Club of Rome, it still exists. Of course, its membership has changed, but it still exists. And since I published my research, they've asked me to be an advisor to them and many other people. And they published a new book this time called Earth for All. And with that, they created a new model of the world, this time with more differences between the regions, because the first model was global. And they wanted to know more about, the difference between countries had increased and also within countries. So they wanted to be able to focus more on inequality. And they identified 5 leverage points in the system where we need to work on if we want to still make that drastic change, because that's the thing, right? At the time, they were like, okay, we can let this go and we can gradually go there. And then we didn't do that. So now we're running out of time. So we need to focus on those points in the system where we can expect maximum leverage. So where you have your actions in that point have a disproportionate effect throughout the system. And they identified 5 leverage points, 2 of them environmental and 3 of them social. So that's, I think, a key thing to understand, and what, in my personal opinion, a lot of people still don't understand. Also, people who are, for example, very passionate about climate change. They think that we can still solve that through environmental problems, through technological solutions. If that was the case, it would already have been solved. This tackling climate change also has a huge social component. And what you see is that, of course, there is resistance from the top, say people who are getting very rich from fossil fuels, but there's also resistance from the bottom. Why is that? And that's because if the transition, because it's inevitably a transition, if the transition is not fair, if it's not perceived as fair, for example, by those people who are now having a dependent on an income from, say, the coal industry, it will be resisted by them as well. So there is a very strong component of equality in there. So the first 2 leverage points, the first one is obviously we need to shift from energy generation to renewable energy generation, phase out fossil fuels, but also be more energy efficient in general. Electrify everything that can be electrified. The second one is how we produce our food, because that's incredibly unsustainable right now. It's the biggest driver of biodiversity loss and desertification. And we still have a growing population. So it's, we're not going to be able to feed everybody if we keep doing it like this. But there are regenerative practices for agriculture. So that not just not deplete the soil, but actually enrich it. So those need to be scaled massively. But the other 3 are social. So there's the inequality within countries. So we need to bring down, we need to do a lot of redistribution there. Again, also this goes to the fair transition part of the energy transition. And the other one is inequality between countries. So we talked about that. We're talking there also about reforms to IMF and World Bank policies, etc. And the 5th one is gender equality. So, more female leadership, all those things are very important. They're an enormous leverage point in the system to really get to that well-being economy where we're sharing our stuff more equally.
I will pick up on some of these things a little bit later in our conversation. The other question that I wanted to ask you, Gaya, is you are at present the VP Sustainability. Now I cannot read my own handwriting. What's your full title again? Sorry.
I'm Vice President of Sustainability Research.
Yes, that's what it was. Now, what are you supposed to do?
I work in the Research Institute, and what I do, it's a very small team, and what I do is basically doesn't have to be commercially viable, certainly not directly. So Schneider Electric was voted most sustainable corporation in the world in 2021. It's a very low bar. So it's, in that sense, I don't think many companies are truly sustainable. So I want to make that caveat. But my point is that we do try. And so that's what I do. I go really to the front line of the emerging sustainability thought leadership and relay that back and see, okay, what do we want to do with this as a company working in the energy transition? That's what we do. We're mostly in we're in energy. We have a large tech component there as well. And so one of the things obviously that I work on that is much more related to what Schneider Electric does is the just transition part, right? So we have all the technological solutions. We're very good at that. But we also realize, okay, we need to, so the social part is just an imperative to also work on. And so we already do that, but that's some of the things that we're focusing on within Schneider. And I think that goes a little bit back to what we said earlier. You have all these big things, these enormous leverage points in the system that you want to work on, and then you choose based on your competencies where you can do the most good.
So you started in 2021 or 2022 working for them?
2022, yeah.
Okay. So is it giving you what you were expecting? Are you able to push, the envelope and
Yes. Yeah.
You are.
Yes, I do feel that. Yes, I've been presenting on this wellbeing economics, so it is something that like I said, this is emerging. So it's really also wondering, how do we work with this then? What does it mean to be a well-being business, for example, right? Those are all. This is all very. Everybody is trying, and I think that's a key thing to remember for anybody listening to this podcast. I think there's a lot of uncertainty. Some people call it the liminal space. So we are in this transition, and what the past business as usual is no way forward. But then what's the new thing, right? We don't know that yet. So that's the liminal space that we're in, and especially the younger generation, they have a lot of eco anxiety, which is very understandable because they will be bearing much of the brunt of the consequences of this, even though they didn't cause it. And so there's such an uncomfortability that comes with that. And my advice would be to sometimes remind yourself that you're not alone, that we're all going through this, unless you're incredibly oblivious. Most of us are going through this, and it really is about just being as comfortable as you can in this uncomfortability while you're just staying connected to your values, and then kind of figure out what it is. And that will have to be, that's why we have these notions now in business a lot, agility and iterative processes, and that, because that really is what it is. Like there's no way there's no stability. No stability is that's strongly put, but we live in a very dynamic environment. There's a lot of future uncertainty, and so that's the I think everybody has that in their own way, and you just search for answers together, and you exchange best practices, and that's how you move forward.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And I really, what you just said is, I think, comforting and helpful for folks out there, and especially as you said, among the younger generation, there is a lot of anxiety. What needs to happen? There is an urgency, and you often don't get that when you look at what's happening in the world and politics and stuff. So yeah, I think the listeners would be we're happy to hear you say that. And anyway, I think they should read your book, because it as I said, I think you're hopeful. It's not about there is no problem, but it's what you have done is this is the situation. We have challenges, but it's not all bad. There are still things that we can do. So I think that's really necessary nowadays in 2023 and beyond.
And I would also like to mention, if I may, that it's free for download. So you
Actually,
you don't have to purchase it. You can purchase a hard copy, but you can just download it, and it's for free.
Why did you do that? Why did you?
Well, because I really want to. I mean, that's for me is kind of the well-being economics thing too, right? My basic needs are met, and then after that, people are really motivated by doing something that they think really contributes to society. And I think that's why I wrote this book. I didn't write this book to sell many copies. I wrote it because I think it will genuinely answer some questions that people have. I think a lot of people have this notion of this cannot possibly be the best system. You're right? I think we all have that sometimes when we look at this can't possibly be the best way to organize ourselves. And it's not. And so, but where do you start? And I thought that my book maybe might help. There's also a lot of personal advice in the vein of what we just discussed about how to navigate that emotionally. And so I wanted to make that available for as many people as possible, and that's why it's free for download. Yeah, so it's called 5 Insights for Avoiding Global Collapse by Gaya Herrington.
Yeah, and I will make sure that we mention the links in the podcast notes, so that people can really download and read it. Hey, Gaya, I would like to go to a couple of questions that I always ask, and it has to do with, this podcast, as you might know, might not know, is a spin-off of a 100-mile walk that I've been doing since 2012, to raise awareness and funds to end hunger, poverty, and injustice. And during COVID, I couldn't walk with others, so I came up with this podcast, and now it has gone out of hand. It's still going, but it's really a lot of fun to do. So I walk, 100 miles in 5 to 7 days. If you would be asked to walk 100 miles in 5 to 7 days, for which cause would you do it?
There's so many causes, first of all, of course, but like I said, I've just been talking about on your podcast. I think one of the root causes is our current economic system that is predicated on growth. So if I could change that, I think a lot of all these other causes would be way less. I think a lot of the social causes and of course the natural causes, nature that's being destroyed, it comes from the unnecessary commodification of things. We commodify nature, even though I think we all feel most of us feel deep inside that nature is sacred, that you cannot put a price on it. Social interaction, same thing, right? And I think that's because and so we all have that in us, but the thing is, if you have an economic system where you have to have continuous growth, once people's needs are met, now you have to start creating endless wants. And so what do you do then? Well, actually, you commodify a social interaction, and then that's what you sell, right? So, and I think that's what's happening. Our social, and then it's actually great that your social needs aren't met much, because then you will keep buying that simulacrum, basically that substitute that will never really satisfy you, so that you keep purchasing it and keep contributing to the growth. So I think a lot of the social woes that we see, for example, is precisely because we have commodified our needs. And in a well-being economy, that wouldn't happen. So that's why I would go to the root cause and work towards changing the economic system.
Okay. When I walk with, when I'm accompanied by others, either for a mile or 10 miles, whatever, we often start talking about the meaning of life, spirituality, religion. I think it has to do with that walking very often, when you do it for many miles, it becomes a spiritual experience almost. And what I'm most intrigued about is then often we start talking about the younger generation and spirituality and religion, and then some of my co-workers said, oh, they are really different, the younger generations, and others saying, no, they're not different. They might go less, at least in Western countries, they might go less to churches, but it doesn't mean they are less spiritual. So my question for you is, what do you see in your community with regard to youth and spirituality and religion?
Yeah, yeah. I think the youth is very plugged in. Personally, I'm very impressed actually with their social awareness. I think they're much better even than I am. When it comes to, for example, LGBTQ, they're very plugged in. They're very aware. So I don't think I don't think they're less caring. You hear this said a lot. I don't see that at all. They are unplugged sometimes because they are very disappointed in the current system, which I think is completely understandable. So I don't blame them at all. What you see in the US, I'm not sure what it's like in Europe, that mental health is actually declining, so deteriorating. It's not going well. If I'm correct, I believe I remember recently seeing on the news that the number one cause of death for teenagers at the moment is suicide. And so that's very disconcerting. It's not that surprising. There's the eco anxiety that I mentioned. Our happiness, that's an interesting thing. Our happiness is not so much tied to, as I've already mentioned, material stuff after a certain point, but it's much more about how our social needs, but also part of the spiritual need is also the peace of mind that this prosperity that we have can last. It's very hard to enjoy anything, even if you have everything in the moment, if you know it can be taken away from you tomorrow. And I think the concept of prospect, I think the younger generation is acutely aware that their prospects are less than that of their parents, and that weighs on them massively, and it's very understandable. I am not a fan of one measure, certainly not GDP, but really not any measure, because again, nothing. Then our needs are just much more of a plethora of all kinds of different wishes. But if I was forced to choose one indicator, I would say to govern a nation by, I would say it's the reported happiness of children. And by those measures, the US is not a great performer, and many countries around the world would not be as successful as we see them today. So I do believe that I completely agree with you. And I think it's a very important question. I think there's a lot of potential in the younger generation. I also think that at the moment, it's underutilized, if not being squandered a little bit.
Talking a little bit about piggybacking on the future and sustainability, the world came up with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I often try to lift this up because not everybody knows about it. And maybe coming from Europe, I'm surprised that this country in the US, many people don't even know about its existence. And I think it's not, it might not, it's far from perfect, but at least it's something that we discussed and we have as a world. And when you talked about the 5 leverage points, when you talk about gender equality, one of the goals is gender equality, right? So my question to all my listeners is, what do you like our listeners to know about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, and just as a side note, the Club of Rome is currently mapping and modeling how the leverage points all contribute to the different SDGs.
Okay.
So yeah, we're very much working with the community there to because we don't want to have different frameworks that are disjointed. So there's a lot of ways that they feed into the SDGs in different ways. I think it's a good comprehensive set. I don't think last time I checked, I don't think there was any country really on track. So that's the downside of them. I do think it's a comprehensive set. I think it's goal 8. They're still clear. They're decent employment and economic performance, I think. And you see that that goal is symbolized with an arrow that goes upwards. So there's still this notion of growth in there. even that I don't mind so much because, the most of the world is not the West. So, most of the world still has some growing to do when it comes to their basic needs. So that's fine. But I will say that, I'm talking to and working with people, for example, at the World Bank as well, about making the message clear that, this development, it's not, if we're talking about international development, like with institutions like the UN and the World Bank, it's not just about the growing of those developed nations, because they literally won't be able to do that. They will bump into planetary boundaries. We're already doing that. We have broken 6 of the 9 quantified planetary boundaries, as done by Rockstrom et al. So they won't be able to do that without, at the same time, rich countries really reducing their ecological footprint. And so that it's a two-prong approach that, right now you only see the first part, but I think inevitably that the second part needs to be way more integrated into there.
Okay. A quick other question I have is we talked about this, as well, about you have to change yourself and the importance of community, mental health and stuff. A growing group of people is saying one of the reasons that we are not reaching those SDGs is because we did not pay proper attention to the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you need as an individual and as a community. So they did a research and a questionnaire, and as a result of the questionnaire, they came up with 5 inner development goals. Being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and action. Have you heard about the IDGs, the inner development goals? And if so, any thoughts on that?
I've read the website, and that's about the extent of my knowledge. So I've heard of them, but that's kind of where it ends. I think it does make sense to me, because you see this in the US a lot too, especially as a Dutch person coming to the US, where the availability of education is so much less than in the Netherlands. So you have such large pockets of the population that are really undereducated, I would say. And then you can see that it's just well-intentioned people, kind people that just simply love their country and actually have this innate desire that I think we all have to leave the world a little bit better than we found it. I do think that's a universal spiritual need that we have. But if you don't have any knowledge about to effectively do that, not only will you be ineffective, but you can actually be dangerous, because you can be influenced by, let's say, social media with algorithms that are not actively working towards your well-being, or just corporations that want to keep selling you certain stuff. And you can really be manipulated to them into doing things that kind of taking advantage of your desire to do good and do things that are really not that good at all, but you wouldn't know it. And I think that's part of the stabilized world scenario or well-being economics model, is also very much more available high quality education. And of course, access to healthcare should be universal as well. So the health and education are key parts of any new system. The US has unparalleled education. I went to Harvard. Unparalleled, it's great. But most Americans will never be able to go there. So, and I mean, there are many great colleges and universities, but, again, most people don't get that great education. So there's almost unparalleled education in the US, but at the same time, also one of the most uneducated people you will ever meet. And that discrepancy is part of the problem, I think. So I think education is a little bit different than what you mentioned with the inner development goals. That's much broader, critical thinking skills. But all of those, I do think, if you have high quality education, will be there. And I think I agree that that's part of the solution.
I have a couple of more questions, but I will do that more in rapid fire. So if we can go a little bit quicker. what I hope to do with this podcast is to really connect people, listeners with, the guests and guests with guests. So, and I came up with a question of the previous guest as a result of that attempt. And the previous guest is asking you,
assuming we are still talking about the unit of analysis being either nonprofits, philanthropies, or INGOs, right? Where does our next speaker see the biggest gap between the espoused values, meaning the values that those nonprofits and NGOs say they are all about, and their real actions, habits, and behaviors? So where is that gap the biggest? And what is the result? What do we see as an implication of that?
Yeah, I think I think there's a little bit of a hint of hypocrisy that that this person is going at, and I actually addressed that in my book as well. And the thing is, I think we're all hypocrites because we live in a system where meeting our needs, you need to be part of the system to meet our basic needs. And so you're always going to be, and those are, again, those are universal. You can't not meet them. So and I think it's for these NGOs, but it's the same for you and I. It's like I'd rather not charge anything for any of my research, even to Schneider Electric, but it's not possible because I also have basic needs. So it's with the NGOs, it's the same thing. They have, I think they want to contribute to their stated goals. At the same time, they have to operate in a system where if they don't produce certain things or where their funding can be taken away. And so that's and some of them have really pivoted to this point where they're making a profit, which I think is fine. If you do that well, I think many of them do that well, actually. And so they're nonprofits, but they are actually generating profits. It's just all generated towards that good cause, which to make them more self-sustaining. I think most of them do that well. I think some of them might be diverting a little bit more to overhead than they should be. But again, that's not that different from, I think, anybody else. Companies are also, no company says on their website, our mission is to make as much profit as possible, even though judged on their behavior, that's really kind of what they do. So my point is we're all hypocrites. We all have the desire to contribute to society, but we're locked into a system where you can only do that really through growth. And that's why I think we need to change that.
Your question for the next guest.
If you just sit for a while and imagine what it would be if your basic needs were just always met as a default. Your need for food and shelter and high quality healthcare, all those things were not dependent on what you did on a daily basis. If that was the case, then how would you spend your time? I think that's worth pondering.
Great. If I would ask you to mention a song or a piece of music that embodies for a big part what you are about, which piece of music or song would that be and why?
Yeah, I mean, I like many songs, but I think the one that embodies what I do is maybe You're the Voice from the rock group Heart. Because that talks about, that you really do have a voice and an ability to influence your society, that we have to make it speak before we take too much time, before we take much longer. And I think and the reason that embodies kind of what I do is because I do believe we all have this, most of us have this longing for something better.
Okay, and we will add the song to a Spotify playlist that we started which you can find if you search within Spotify for hashtag Walk Talk Listen, and you see all the songs that have been selected by or picked by my guest. Hey Gaya, a guy called Steve Hartman of CBS in the US examines at the moment how one simple act of kindness creates a ripple effect. What are your thoughts about that? About the simple act of kindness in creating a ripple effect? That's one part of the question. The second part is, if we would ask you on the spot to commit to one simple act of kindness this week, what would you do?
Yeah, I think we've seen. I remember seeing some research about that before this. So I'm not sure how long he's been doing that, but I that has been that ripple effect. I think that notion is has been around for at least a decade, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's absolutely true. And the same is true for other things. When people are not nice, that typically, we're social animals. We pick up on those energies. So certainly that's the case. I personally am kind because of more of an inherent motivation.
Mm-hmm.
That just works best for me. It's more about what kind of person I want to be. And so whether or not my kindness creates a ripple effect is not really my motivation. It's just this is the kind of person I would like to be in this moment. And what the other person does with it is not my business, really. So that's just my personal motivation for being kind. I like I mean, there's so many ways. I typically try to look for how I can be kind in every situation, and it differs in many different ways. I give away my stuff for free. I get a real enjoyment from that, actually, knowing that the things that I don't use anymore are being used. That feels like the natural order of things to me. I don't believe that stuff should be sitting there in your garage collecting dust. I give to charity. I hold the door open for people. I mean, all those acts of kindness are, again, ultimately, they make my life better. They make because I create a world in where I live where people do that for one another, and that just makes me feel better already just doing it. So I really can't think of one specific act of kindness because I just do it around the day as much as I can.
I think you did one by speaking with me for the last hour, so I really appreciate that, and yeah, I learned a lot and I enjoyed listening to you, and I'm sure the listeners as well. Any message, invitation, or question for the listeners?
I would maybe end with how I end my book. So I'm giving away the ending, and maybe I shouldn't do that. But I mean, there's more interesting stuff before the ending too.
There is, yeah.
But I would say that in a system where that's predicated on eternal growth, you will inevitably have been told that you're not good enough, because in a narrative that says you can never have enough, you are made to feel like you never are enough. And so I would just leave this podcast and share with your listeners that you are more and better than what you've been told.
Right, and I like that. Linking it with the word enough, and my organization has a slogan in terms of there is enough for all. And I also interviewed, I think 2 years ago, a singer called Maya Susena who made a song recently about enough, very powerful. So I would really encourage you to check that song out, and the listeners as well. So yeah, Gaya, before I ask the last question, is a quick one. Is you told me before we started that you're 7 months pregnant. Is that changing you already in the way you do your work? And I mean, not because you're getting bigger. Obviously, that also brings along things with it. But just because of, there will be a child in your life and with your partner. Yeah.
I get that. I this is my second and last one, by the way. But so I already am a mother. She's 2 years old now, and I think in general, maybe surprisingly, it hasn't shaped my view much, because I really would care about the future generation, even though if none of them are mine. But I guess there's more of an emotional part when I see how much my daughter just blindly trusts me that I will take care of her. And I think I have a little bit more empathy even for the younger generation because of that they are growing up now. Her trust in me is still blind, but that will change at some point. And that's what we talked about, the mental health of teenagers, etc. They are awakening to the fact that they were not taken care of by the older generations that should have, I think. And I guess I'm even more empathetic to that part. I think that's if I can see the happiness that she takes for granted, that she's taken care of, losing that must be just, I'm not surprised at all that there's a lot of mental health issues in the younger generation. And I guess, like I said, I have more empathy for that.
Right. Thanks. Any question that I should have asked you and I didn't?
I think we covered a lot already. No, I think we're good. I do like what you mentioned about the concept of enough, though. That is certainly something that I think came through in my words, but that's also, I very explicitly mention in my book, this concept of enough and the double meaning of it too, right? So certainly enough for each, that's the first meaning, but also enough as in not beyond this limit. So that's the planetary boundaries ones. We do enough, and at a certain point, we don't go beyond there, because then we're asking too much of Mother Nature, basically. So I would say, if there's one word that I could use to describe what our dogma should be, it wouldn't be growth anymore. It would be enough.
Thank you so much, Gaya, for your willingness to talk with me today, for everything you do, and all the best with the coming months and beyond, of course. So thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.